On the evening of the 21st of October, 1978, 20-year-old pilot Frederick Valentich set out on a routine flight across Bass Strait. He departed Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne in a Cessna 182L and was expected to arrive at King Island later that night. What should have been a short trip instead became one of Australia's most debated aviation disappearances. While over Bass Strait, Valentich contacted Melbourne Flight Service and reported that another aircraft appeared to be flying above him. What happened next is known largely through the radio transcript. The exchange shows how the report changed from unusual to difficult to interpret.
This is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000 feet?
No known traffic.
Seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000 feet.
What type of aircraft is it?
I cannot confirm. It's four bright, seems to me like landing lights. The aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity?
No known aircraft in the vicinity.
Seems to be playing some sort of game. He's flying over me. Delta Sierra Juliet, it's not an aircraft, it's...
Can you describe the aircraft?
As it's flying past, it's a long shape. Cannot identify it, it has such speed. It's before me right now, Melbourne.
How large would the object be?
Seems like it's stationary. What it's doing right now is orbiting. The thing is just orbiting on top of me. It's also got a green light and a sort of metallic, like, it's shiny on the outside. It's just vanished. That strange aircraft's hovering on top of me again. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft.
When Valentich failed to reach King Island, search and rescue operations were launched. Aircraft and vessels searched a large area of Bass Strait, but no confirmed sign of either Valentich or the Cessna was found at the time. With no wreckage recovered and no distress signal beyond the final transmission, investigators were left with very little physical evidence to work from. That absence of evidence quickly pushed attention toward the transcript itself. The disappearance was no longer just a missing aircraft case. It had become a mystery built around a final radio exchange. The wording was unusual, the timing was abrupt, and the lack of a confirmed crash site meant there was nothing solid to settle what had happened in those last moments. As public interest grew, the case began to attract more speculative explanations. The final line in particular led to widespread discussion of UFOs and alien abduction. But investigators and later researchers also considered more ordinary possibilities. One of the main explanations was that Valentich became disoriented while flying at night over open water. In that scenario, the lights he described may not have belonged to another aircraft at all. He may have been misreading reflections, nearby lights, or even aspects of his own aircraft while losing spatial orientation. His report that the object was moving around him may have reflected the movement of his own aircraft rather than something external. That theory gained weight because of what later emerged about Valentich's experience and preparation. Public accounts of the investigation say he had around 150 hours of flying time and had encountered difficulties in parts of his pilot training. Reports also noted that he gave inconsistent reasons for the trip to King Island and had not made the usual arrangements for runway lighting at his destination. None of those details proves what happened, but together they gave investigators reason to consider pilot error or confusion as a serious possibility. On August 2, 1947, a British South American Airways aircraft, known as Star Dust, disappeared while crossing the Andes from Buenos Aires to Santiago. The aircraft was an Avro Lancastrian, and there were 11 people on board. At first, the flight had followed a familiar route. The aircraft had left Buenos Aires and was heading west toward Chile, crossing some of the most difficult mountain terrain in the world. Weather conditions in the Andes were often unstable, but at that stage, there was no sign that the flight would vanish without explanation. As the aircraft approached the mountains, the crew sent a final Morse code message to Santiago. It consisted of a single word: Stendek. The message was repeated, but no one on the ground understood what it meant. Soon afterward, contact was lost. Stardust never arrived in Santiago. Search efforts began quickly, but they produced no immediate result. No wreckage was found, and no confirmed trace of the aircraft appeared in the days that followed. That absence of evidence helped turn the disappearance into a long-running mystery. For years, Stendek became the central puzzle of the case. Some believed it was a mistyped message. Others thought it might have been an acronym, a coded warning, or a sign that something unusual had happened on board. The case remained unresolved for decades. Then, more than 50 years later, climbers on Mount Tupungato in Argentina found aircraft debris high on the mountain. The discovery was followed by recovery work that identified wreckage from stardust, along with human remains preserved in the ice. The evidence showed that the aircraft had not disappeared into thin air. It had crashed high in the Andes and remained hidden beneath snow and glacier ice for decades. That discovery changed the direction of the case. Once the wreckage was found, investigators were able to move away from the more speculative explanations that had surrounded the disappearance for years. The most likely conclusion was that the crew had misjudged their position while crossing the mountains, possibly because of strong headwinds, and began descending too early, believing they had already cleared the Andes. In that account, the final message was sent shortly before the aircraft struck Mount Tupungato. Even then, the final transmission was never fully settled in a definitive way. One later interpretation suggested that Stendek may have been a garbled or compressed emergency message connected to turbulence, descent, or an attempted forced landing. But no explanation has achieved universal acceptance. On March 15, 1962, a Flying Tiger Line charter flight operating for the Military Air Transport Service departed Naval Air Station Agana, Guam, bound for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. On board were 107 people, a flight crew, cabin crew, and 96 passengers, most of them U.S. Army electronics and communications specialists, along with 3 Vietnamese military personnel. The aircraft was a Lockheed Super Constellation. The journey had already taken the aircraft across much of the Pacific. It had left Travis Air Force Base in California the previous day and stopped at Honolulu, Wake Island, and Guam before beginning the final leg westward. When it left Guam at 12:57 p.m., it climbed to 18,000 feet and carried enough fuel for 9 hours and 30 minutes of flight, well beyond the estimated 6 hours and 19 minutes required for the route. About an hour and a half after departure, the crew sent what would become their final confirmed transmission. At 2:22 p.m., Flight 739 radioed the Guam International Flight Service Station, reporting its position at 2:16 p.m. as 13 degrees 40 minutes north, 140 degrees east, maintaining 18,000 feet. The navigator also gave an estimated future position for 3:30 at 14 degrees 0 minutes north, 135 degrees 0 minutes east. Nothing in that message indicated distress. The next report never came. When the aircraft failed to make its scheduled 3:30 p.m. position call, radio operators began trying to reach it. Those attempts produced no response. Later that day, search and rescue operations were launched from Naval Air Station Agana and Clark Air Force Base, and by 10:27 p.m., the aircraft had been officially declared lost. As the search began, a second line of evidence emerged. The crew of the Standard Oil tanker SSTL Lenzen reported that at about 3:30 p.m., 5 people on board had seen a mid-air explosion near the position where Flight 739 was expected to be. According to the later account, they first noticed a vapor trail or something similar moving east to west overhead. Then, as it passed behind a cloud, they saw an intensely bright explosion, described as a white center surrounded by a reddish-orange edge, followed by 2 flaming objects falling into the sea at different speeds. One of those falling objects was reportedly tracked briefly on the ship's radar. The tanker's captain reversed course and searched the area, but no signal, wreckage, or additional sighting followed. That point mattered immediately. If the ship's crew had seen Flight 739 break apart in the air, then the disappearance may have been explained in broad terms. But if that was the case, there should have been evidence in the water below. None was found. The search that followed was extensive. According to the later summary of the investigation, it covered 144,000 square miles and involved 1,300 people, 48 aircraft, and 8 surface vessels. A total of 377 air sorties were flown, amounting to more than 3,417 flying hours. Even after that effort, investigators found nothing that could be conclusively linked to the missing aircraft or anyone on board. The Civil Aeronautics Board later reviewed the available evidence and reached a narrow conclusion. A summation of all relevant factors tends to indicate that the aircraft was destroyed in flight. However, due to the lack of any substantiating evidence, the board is unable to state with any degree of certainty the exact fate of the missing Flight 739. The uncertainty led quickly to speculation. Contemporary reporting raised the possibility of sabotage, arguing that such a violent explosion would have been difficult to explain under normal operating conditions. Another theory suggested hijacking. None of those possibilities could be tested properly because the aircraft was never found. The absence of wreckage prevented the case from moving beyond suggestion and probability. August 16, 1942. The U.S. Navy Blimp L-8 lifted off from Treasure Island in San Francisco for a routine anti-submarine patrol along the California coast. On board were Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. It was Adams's first flight as a commissioned officer. The route was meant to take L-8 out toward the Farallon Islands, then back along the coast past Point Reyes and Montara before returning to base. At 7:38 a.m., the crew radioed that they had spotted an oil slick about 4 miles off the Farallon Islands. Witnesses in the area later reported seeing the blimp descend to a very low altitude and circle over the slick, as though the crew were investigating it more closely. That was the last confirmed sighting of the blimp, with both men still aboard. After that, the patrol no longer followed its expected pattern. Contact with the crew was lost at 8:50 a.m. Sometime after 9 a.m., the blimp dropped ballast, climbed, and turned back east towards San Francisco instead of continuing northwest. Hours later, at about 11:15 a.m., it reappeared off Ocean Beach at low altitude, drifting toward shore. 2 fishermen on the beach grabbed at the mooring lines and looked into the gondola. There was no one inside. The fishermen could not hold the blimp down. It rose again, struck a cliff, lost part of its load, and drifted inland over San Francisco. As helium escaped, the envelope sagged into a V shape. Eventually, the blimp lost height, scraped poles and rooftops, and came down on Bellevue Avenue in Daly City. The landing itself was light enough that, if the crew had been aboard, they would likely have survived it. The investigation began with a simple question. If the blimp came back largely intact, where had the two men gone? Search parties examined the coastline, the ocean below the patrol route, and the crash site. Inside the gondola, most things were still in place. The parachutes were there. The rubber life raft was there. The radio was still switched on. Nothing appeared disturbed, except that the two yellow life jackets worn on overwater flights were missing. The door was fastened back, as if it had been opened deliberately during the patrol. Investigators also looked for signs that the blimp had touched the sea. That would have made it easier to imagine the crew being thrown overboard or abandoning the gondola. But the evidence pointed away from that. The Navy found no indication that L-8 had been shot down, burned, or landed on the water. Also, the compartment beneath the floor showed a layer of dust and a complete lack of moisture, which was treated as strong support for the view that the blimp had never entered the ocean. That left the Navy with an official explanation, but not a complete one. The accepted theory was that while investigating the oil slick, one crewman may have opened the rear hatch to drop a smoke marker, slipped, and ended up hanging outside the gondola. The second man may then have left the controls to help him, causing both to fall into the sea. In that account, the sudden loss of their weight would explain why the blimp climbed away on its own. Later, as helium vented and one depth charge came loose, the blimp's strange path back toward land could be explained by ordinary physical forces rather than active control. Even the Navy's own account did not settle the matter. The theory left two obvious questions unanswered: why no one saw the men fall, and why no trace of them was ever found despite the search and the visibility of their life jackets. Those gaps are what kept the case open in practical terms. The men were later declared legally dead, and the blimp was repaired and returned to service. No confirmed trace of either officer was ever found.